Welcome to the first of a new series of classes on the Son of Promise and the Master Manipulator, looking at the lives of Isaac and Jacob from Genesis 25 to 38. Our plan in this 12-lesson series is to study chapters 25 to 38, although I'm going to leave chapter 37 out until a later series, which will concentrate on Joseph. For our first lesson, we will summarize the first part of Isaac's life and then concentrate on the last half of chapter 25. So let's begin way back with the promise that God gave to Abraham. And I'm reading here from McCord's translation. Back in Genesis 12, Yahweh had said to Abram, "Go from your land and your kindred and your father's house to a land which I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and magnify your name. You will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed." This is the introduction to Abraham, apart from the genealogy in chapter 11. This was God's promise to him. He was going to make of him a great nation, and through him, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Now, both aspects of this promise required Abram as he is at this point in time, but it required him to have children. You can't become a great nation without first having a child. Even the blessing, as we know from later study, was contingent on a child, as the blessing was about the coming of the Messiah. At this time, Abraham was 75. It says that in verse 4 of chapter 12. Sarah was 10 years younger. But that promised son did not come quickly. Let's jump ahead to chapter 15. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Abram replied, "O Lord Yahweh, what will you give to me? I have no child, and my heir will be Eliezer of Damascus." Also Abram said, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house will inherit my estate." But the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, "This man shall not inherit your estate, but one whom you shall father, shall be your heir." Some time had passed, and there was still no child. And Abraham seems to have been somewhat aware of the passing of time, and that he was getting older. So to have his life in order, he had decided his heir would be a trusted slave. Well, God told him that was not his plan. Abraham's heir would be someone that he had fathered, and God renewed that covenant he had made earlier. Time was still passing. We get to the next chapter, chapter 16. Abraham and Sarah decide maybe they should help God a bit. Chapter 16, verse 1. Sarai, Abram's wife, was not able to become pregnant. She had an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Yahweh has not allowed me to have a child. Go in now to my slave girl. Perhaps I'll have a child by her." Abram listened to what Sarai had said. God's promise to Abraham had been that his heir would be somebody that he had fathered. So Sarah got the bright idea that he could have a child by one of her female slaves. And by the way, that was not an uncommon practice at this time. After all, Sarah at this point was 75 now. And I'm sure in her mind, she was well past the age of having children. Abraham obeyed his wife. and slept with her slave Hagar, and the slave became pregnant. A son was born whom Abraham named Ishmael. Abraham was now 86 years old. When God next appeared to Abraham at 99, he once again emphasized that Abraham would be the father of a multitude of nations and that he would be extremely fruitful. And that was the point, that their names were changed, and God gave instructions about circumcision. He added to this that Sarah would become a mother of nations. So we're going to go into chapter 17. So between chapter 16 and chapter 17, about 13 years have passed. Chapter 17, breaking in at verse 15. As to Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, which means contentious, but Sarah, which means princess. I will bless her. I will give you a son by her. Indeed, I will bless her. She shall be a mother of nations, and kings of people shall come from her. Again, Abram fell on his face. This time he laughed and said in his heart, can 100-year-old man father a son? Can Sarah, 90 years old, become a mother? Then Abraham said, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But you see, Ishmael was rejected by God as the one who would become Abraham's heir. He was not the son of promise. Sarah would have her own son. Later, if you remember, they were visited by 3 men who we later discover are God's messengers. And this time, Abraham was told that he would have a son by the next season. In other words, it's almost here. It's just about to happen. This time, Sarah overheard the conversation, and she laughed, as Abraham had laughed earlier, which led to their son's name being Isaac, which means laughter. And finally, Isaac was born. Chapter 21 of Genesis. And Yahweh visited Sarah as he had promised, at the set of time which God had spoken. Sarah conceived and bore to Abraham a son in his old age. Abraham called his son's name Isaac. When Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So finally, Isaac was born. It was 25 years after God's first promise. He was circumcised when he was 8 days old, a practice which continued for all who were descendants of Abraham. Now, we don't have much detail about Isaac growing up. The text mentions that his older stepbrother Ishmael was a bit of a torment towards him, which led to Hagar and Ishmael being sent away. Later, God told Abraham to offer his only son Isaac as a sacrifice. Undoubtedly, that was a traumatic event for a young man in his teens, which would prefigure so much. But that's not for this lesson. Sarah died when she was 127 years old. Incidentally, she's the only woman in Scripture whose age at death is recorded. Isaac would have been 37 at this time, and he's still single. It was time for him to have a wife. Abraham sent his oldest servant, and it does identify him as Eliezer, but who knows if Eliezer's still alive. It could have been him. But he sent his oldest servant on a task of great magnitude to go and find a wife for his son. Genesis chapter 24, the first verse. Now Abraham was aging, and Yahweh had blessed him in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the elder of his house, who is in charge of all Abraham's properties, put your hand under my thigh. I will make you to swear by Yahweh, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but you'll go to my country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son, for Isaac." And to cut a long story short, the servant traveled north to where Abraham's relatives had settled. He found a beautiful young woman who was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother, and she was single. After presenting gifts, she agreed to return with the servant to where Isaac was living. And we'll break in towards the end of chapter 24, which is Isaac for the first time meeting his wife, or the one who would be his wife. Now, Isaac had departed from Beer Lahai Roi and was living in the Negev. He went out in the evening to a field to meditate, and looking up, he saw camels coming. Rebekah also looked up, saw Isaac, and dismounted. She asked the servant, "Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?" The servant answered, "He is my master." She took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac everything that had happened. Isaac then took Rebekah, brought her into his mother's tent, and she became his wife. He loved her, as Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. We will see that Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah. He had been mourning his mother for 3 years. In the meantime, by the way, Abraham took another wife. Her name was Keturah. He had 6 sons by her, and many of these are names we recognize, as their descendants inhabited the area and named their nations after them. As the text turns to Isaac and his family, it wraps up Abraham's narrative, although in reality he had not yet died when Isaac's first children were born. We're going to pick up with the narrative of Isaac in chapter 25, starting at verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, who was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, as his wife. Because Rebekah was barren, Isaac prayed to Yahweh, and Yahweh heard his prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is this way, why do I live?" She went and asked Yahweh, who responded to her, "2 children are in your womb. 2 peoples within you will be divided. One nation will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger." When her time was fulfilled, twins were in her womb. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment. They called his name Esau, which means hairy. Afterwards, his brother came out with a hand on Esau's heel, and they called his name Jacob, which could mean heel grabber or supplanter. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. Bill Grasham comments on the opening of this. These are the generations, pointing out that this is the 8th occurrence in Genesis of Toldoth. And here it's rendered the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. What follows is not so much a genealogical record as an ancestral narrative, an account of Isaac and his sons. The child of promise is primarily mentioned in connection with his father, Abraham, or in relationship to his son, Jacob. So what Bill is saying is the information we have about Isaac is brief especially compared to that of Abraham and Jacob. Isaac's narrative mainly serves as a bridge between the one who is the father of the Hebrews and the one whose name they wore as a nation, and whose sons defined their divisions within that nation. We know that Isaac was a great man of faith because he was willing to go through being offered as a sacrifice. He was a man that we saw just a few minutes ago, spent time meditating. Notice that we have this colophon, this Toldoth. One view is that this is the ending rather than the beginning of the writer's contribution. Henry Morris believes that Isaac may have received the preceding information from Ishmael when they buried Abraham, and that he would have been responsible for 1127 up until this point, basically the narrative about Abraham. Jacob would be the one responsible for this section all the way up into chapter 37, verse 2. But one thing we learned from this section is that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Bill Grasham goes on to say, the record does not disclose why Isaac was 40 years old before he married. The main reason Isaac remained unmarried for so long seems to be that Abraham was wary to find an appropriate bride for his son among the Canaanites. Finally, after prolonged hesitation, he concluded that no suitable mate was available in the Promised Land. Therefore, he commissioned his most trusted servant to travel to Haran. He was to find Bethuel, his brother Nahor's son, so he could look for a proper wife for Isaac among that family. Isaac and Rebekah married, set up a home together, and for the next 20 years, they were childless. Rebekah was barren, as Sarah had been. Isaac prayed to God for Rebekah, and she was able to conceive. She was carrying twins, which resulted in a difficult pregnancy. The children struggled together within her. Basically, they were fighting in the womb. The Hebrew word suggests a struggle that was out of the ordinary. Again, Bill Grasham recorded, her original problem was getting pregnant, but now being pregnant was causing her so much anguish that she began to wonder if it was worth the pain and distress. She inquired of God why this was. That she questioned this of God shows her growing despair over the struggle of her unborn children. God's answer? She had 2 nations in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. Notice God's determined all of this beforehand. This is mentioned throughout Scripture. God's choosing the younger son over the older son. Paul comments on this in Romans chapter 9. Also, when Rebekah was with child by Isaac our father, before the children were born, had done nothing good or bad, that God's purpose by election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger, as it is written, I loved Jacob, but Esau I hated. And that's a reference primarily to Malachi chapter 1. And there we find this. I have shown love to you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you shown love to us? Esau was Jacob's brother, the Lord explains. Yet I chose Jacob and rejected Esau. I turned to Esau's mountains into a deserted wasteland and gave his territory to the wild jackals. Edom says, though we are devastated, we will once again build the ruined places. So the Lord of heaven's armies responds, they indeed may build, but I will overthrow. They will be known as the land of evil, the people with whom the Lord is permanently displeased. Henry Morris comments, men normally have felt that the firstborn son should receive the greater honor and inheritance. But God does not necessarily work in such ways. In the Messianic line, it's significant that neither Seth, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, nor David were firstborn sons. It's not certain if any of the others were. Even though God had selected one of the sons and not the other as the one through whom the promise would continue, this did not condemn the other son to not serving him. Esau, as we're going to see, was the older. He chose the route of his life. This is not election as is believed in a good part of the religious groups which have their origin in John Calvin. This was really not about the boys. The boys hadn't done anything yet, good or bad. This was about their descendants and the nations that would come from them. Isaac's later blessing would be the same. It's not about their boys, but about their future descendants. Bill Grasham writes, the descendants of the older one would serve the offspring of the younger one, for the latter would be the stronger of the two. Therefore, the prophecy was not primarily about Esau and Jacob as individuals, even though they did struggle in the womb and in later manhood for supremacy. In reality, Esau, the elder one, never personally served his younger brother Jacob. What God envisioned was the future subjugation of the Edomites by the Israelites, who would arise from Esau and Jacob, respectively. Two boys were born. The firstborn was Esau. He was red at birth. His body, the text says, was like a hairy cloak. He was quite a hairy baby. He received the name Edom in the next few verses, which means red. There are two plays on words connect with Esau. The Hebrew word for reddish forms a word play with Edom, which is what the area was eventually called where his descendants lived. And the Hebrew word for hairy sounds like and is similar to the word seir, S-E-I-R. And there was a mountain in Edom that they called Mount Seir. The area where Esau and his descendants settled used both of those terms. One is the word for the nation, the other was the name of the mountains in their region. Second twin was Jacob. And Jacob was born holding on to Esau's heel. As we commented from the text, Jacob means he who takes, or he takes by the heel. Bill Grasham says, the symbolism is important here because the second boy appeared to be attempting to hold back and overtake his brother. And this struggle in the womb anticipated what would continue in their lives. The word for heel is related to the word for deceived, which would characterize Jacob. It's thought that he was light and smooth, at least he was in later life, very much a contrast to Esau. They were twins, but they were not identical twins. And Isaac's now 60 years old. Abraham would have still been alive and would have been 160 years old. Keep in mind that he died when he was 175. Now, Bible Study Notes points out that in this section here, some valuable information is provided. We learn here that Isaac married 35 years before Abraham died, that Rebekah was barren for 20 years, that Abraham would have lived to see Jacob and Esau begin to grow up. The death of Abraham was recorded in the first part of the chapter as a tidying up of one generation before beginning the account of the next. And that's a fairly frequent device that biblical writers use to wrap up one character before getting into the next, but not to imply that the first character is dead. First character is still alive and well, thank you. But we're just wrapping up that story to be able to concentrate on the next story. Beginning in verse 27. The boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, an outdoors man, while Jacob was a quiet indoors man. Isaac loved Esau, for he put venison in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob was cooking stew when Esau came in from the field, and he was hungry. Esau said to Jacob, "Red stew, give me some, for I am famished." This was the reason his name was called Edom, or red. Jacob replied, "Sell to me today your birthright." Esau answered, "Look, I'm dying. What good's a birthright to me? Jacob said, Swear to me today. And so Esau sold his birthright. Then Jacob gave bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate and drank and rose up and went away. So Esau despised his birthright. See, we don't have much information except some general statements as the boys grew up. But Esau became an outdoorsman, a skillful hunter. Morris commented as to why Esau became a hunter, as they would have had more than enough food in their flocks and possibly herds. He suggested that he may have had to be skillful in order to find game to kill. Jacob, on the other hand, was quiet, staying more indoors, presumably taking care of the sheep. See, we almost have Cain and Abel revisited here. Apparently, the Hebrew word tam, frequently translated quiet or plain the description of Jacob, is better translated as perfect, complete, or mature. That's the same word we find when God refers to Job as blameless in Job chapter 1, verse 8. So Net Bible Study Notes comments, in contrast to Esau, a man of the field, Jacob was civilized, as the phrase living in tents signifies. Whereas Esau was a skillful hunter, Jacob was calm and even-tempered, which normally has the idea of blameless. The parents, though, were partial. Isaac loved Esau because of the gain he would bring for him to eat. Rebekah loved Jacob. It isn't that they disliked the other child, but that one was their favorite, and they were partial to them. Edwin Jones wrote, Such obvious displays of parental preference are often the seeds of considerable problems. And this is a problem that's going to continue for generations. Esau, as firstborn, had the birthright. The firstborn usually received a major part of the inheritance. Later, under the law of Moses, the firstborn received a double portion of the inheritance. Other documents, their tablets from this time period, indicate the same thing, although we don't know with certainty what would happen with Isaac and his sons, because the old law's not been given yet, and we don't know what exactly they were following, whether Esau would have been in line to get a double portion. The Newsy tablets, by the way, that we found, allow for the selling of a birthright to the person's siblings. But the idea of birthright also conveyed the headship of the family when the patriarch died or retired. Esau came in immensely hungry one day. He asked Jacob for some of his red stuff. That's what the Hebrew literally says. King James, I think, translated a pottage, which I'm not sure helps a whole lot. Basically, it's lentil soup. Because Esau was famished, my guess, if he's hunting, he may have been out for several days, possibly not having anything to eat. So he may well have been very hungry, and smelling what was cooking would have been too much for his empty stomach. So Jacob bargained with him. You let me have the birthright, I'll give you some soup. He may have initially said this in jest, not believing Esau would really agree to it. But Esau reasoned, if I don't eat, I'll die, so the birthright is of no use to me. So he sold his birthright for some bread and lentil soup. Jacob would then have seen that the birthright really meant nothing to Esau. That Bible Study Notes points out that there are some significant words and word plays in this story that help clarify the points of the story. The verb cook is zid, which sounds like the word for hunter, tzayid. This is deliberate, for the hunter becomes the hunted in the story. The word zid means to cook, to boil. But by the sound play with that Said, it comes to mean set a trap by cooking. The usage of the word shows that it can also have the connotation of acting presumptuously, as in boiling over. This too may be a comment on the scene. Jacob required Esau to swear to him that he would give him his birthright for the soup, and that would have bound their agreement. This narrative attributes his name Edom to his selling his birthright for the red soup. Keeping in mind, Edom means red. Again, that Bible study note says Esau's descendants would eventually be called Edom. Edom was the place where they lived, so named probably because of the reddish nature of the hills. The writer can use the word red to describe the stew that Esau gasped for to convey the nature of Esau and his descendants. They were a lusty, passionate, and profane people who lived for the moment. Again, the wordplay is meant to capture the omen in the nomen. I like that little phrase at the end. Of course, if you remember your New Testament, the Hebrew writer referred to this incident as well. It's in Hebrews chapter 12. Take care that no one falls short of God's grace. Take care that no bitter root springs up and troubles you and defiles many. Take care that no one be immoral or irreligious like Esau, who gave up his birthright for one meal. You know that when he later wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. He could not get his father to change his mind, though he begged tearfully. Of course, what the Hebrew writer is recording is jumping ahead of where we currently are in the narrative. Edwin Jones writes, this story that follows the occasion of their birth draws from the theme that the older would serve the younger. However, rather than letting God be in control of such things, Jacob saw the need to exploit the weakness of his brother to wrestle the birthright from him. And I think that is a valid point. Henry Morris said, "Why do people so often consider Jacob the culprit in this transaction? Scripture does not offer one word of condemnation or criticism of Jacob. Instead, it condemns Esau unequivocally. Jacob, of course, should have let God work out this problem. God would certainly have overruled the situation, even if Isaac had not been willing to give Jacob the birthright as God had instructed him. However, Jacob's sin was not a sin of greed or blackmail, but rather one of lack of faith. He so strongly wanted to see God's purposes advanced that he felt he must help them along by his own actions. This idea of helping God casts our minds back to Abraham and Sarah, does it not? But that's what the text says. Esau then despised his birthright. After all, he had lost it. Now, Bible study note says, this clause, which concludes the episode, is a summary statement which reveals the underlying significance of Esau's actions. To despise means to treat something as worthless or with contempt. Esau's willingness to sell his birthright was evidence that he considered it to be unimportant. This shows that he really did not properly value that which was important. It's interesting that the birthright was Esau's. In light of God telling Rebekah that the younger was to be the important one, with the older serving the younger, and yet he's the older one. He's the one that initially has the birthright. Perhaps this was to show that God truly was in control, even though the situation did not seem to be what was expected. There are some lessons that we can learn, I think, from the life of Isaac and Abraham for that matter, but we're concentrating on Isaac here. One that popped to my mind: when we're struggling with a problem, we need to take it to God as Isaac and Rebekah did. Rebekah couldn't get pregnant, and it says that Isaac prayed to God. Bill Gresham commented, as husband and wife, Isaac and Rebekah turned to God in prayer regarding their major decisions in life. Isaac prayed about their lack of a child, and then, after 20 years of marriage, Rebekah conceived. She prayed about her unusual condition in bearing twins. Prayer was apparently a normal experience in this home. I think that's a great comment. And the second lesson I wanted to bring out was this problem of favoritism towards our children. Now, when I was growing up, I have 3 siblings. My dad always said that he had 4 favorites. His favorite oldest son, his favorite middle son, which is me, and his favorite youngest son, and his favorite daughter. I always thought that was a good policy, that we were all my dad's favorites. As we're going to see in later lessons, the favoritism practiced by Isaac and Rebekah had long-reaching consequences. Thank you for joining us for this first in this series of lessons. In our next lesson, we will plan to look at chapter 26, which deals with Isaac and Abimelech, and we'll see a bit of Isaac worshiping God. Join us if you can for that particular lesson.